So before we get into the revolution, I want to address some of the precursors to the revolution and also kind of look at how women played a role in helping develop the revolution. So that's what it's called, Prelude to the Revolution. In the 1750s and 60s, not the United States, but the British are in war with different people, one the French and then Native Americans, and these were called the French and Indian Wars from 54 to 63. And if you know anything about war is expensive, right? So somebody needs to pay for these things. So the British instituted new taxes in order to pay for the wars that happened, in the past. And, most people don't like to pay taxes, so this caused a bit of friction. So the British implemented the Revenue Act of 64, which is a Sugar Act. Again, these are products that people tend to buy on a regular basis. The Stamp Act of 65, where people had to pay a tax basically to file any kind of legal documents. The Townsend Act of 67, which taxed different goods. And, it kind of taxes if you have money or if you don't have money, it taxes you all, right? So if somebody who's poor tends to have a bigger impact on these taxes than somebody who's rich. This is the problem with a flat tax a lot of times. And so with these taxes being implemented to pay for these wars in order to kind of create a safety environment for many of the colonists, Americans did not want to pay the taxes. And much of the burden was put on women because it's women who go out to the market and buy these goods, right? So much of the impact, or part of the impact, was on women at this time. In addition, you have another kind of major event, which was called the Great Awakening, and this was a religious movement in the late 18th century, which began to promote this idea of egalitarianism, basically of equality. So these are religious gatherings, and women are able to participate in different ways. And, it's basically people reading the Bible and saying, look, everybody's equal to some extent, right? So these groups are kind of questioning the concept of hierarchy. Why are men above women when we should be equal partners? So these things kind of help motivate women as the revolution is right around the corner. So I'll have an activity for you to do in a minute that revolves around the reading. But just to kind of add a little bit to the reading, we find that women participated in the war effort, right? So the reading does talk about the spinning bees, where they put their skills to create textiles. In the South, slave owners put slaves to, create textiles back, down there. So these were important roles that they took because the way the economy worked in the American colonies was that the United States would produce the raw material and then send cotton to Britain, where they would create the yarn and the fabric and then sell it back to us, obviously at a higher rate because now it's a finished product. So what this does, as we're getting closer to the revolution, is that everything's being produced here at home, trying to make us a little bit more self-dependent rather than focusing on England bringing us these finished products. So this is just a person that talks about, again, the idea of the United States. We're not the U.S. quite yet, but our virtues as different colonies, right? But here's a great example where a woman is advocating these virtues that become part of the rhetoric of the American Revolution. And we find that a lot of women participated, and again, very symbolic ways in order to challenge the British. So women played a very important role in heading towards the American Revolution. African American women, we find, that African Americans were kind of stuck in a weird position, particularly those that were slaves, because the British actually offered them their freedom if they fought for the British. So they were, kind of torn as to who to fight for at this time. We have examples of them fighting for the British and examples of them fighting for the what do you call it, for the colonies. There's a great video out there that talks about if the American Revolution was going on, what side would you fight for, and who you would fight for. And it's interesting, as you saw in the reading, what was it, like 60% did not support the American Revolution. So it's understandably that a lot of people would have fought for the British, but we find that African Americans were able to get their freedom, and this is one example of Elizabeth Freeman. You see, their last names kind of address their social standing, where she was able to get her freedom through the court system. We find that in the North, they began to implement emancipation during the American Revolution. In Pennsylvania, which is a little bit, not quite in the South, but close during this time, it would have been somewhat of a Southern economy. They got their freedom when they turned the age of 28. So these events kind of allowed certain groups some opportunities to liberate themselves from their status at that particular time. In the end, what happens? Well, there are some positive outcomes. We find that divorce is allowed in the United States during this period, after the Revolution. We find that some people begin to see them as as a tighter family unit. Here you have an example of Mrs. Bartlett saying, using this word ours to describe property, whereas before it would have been his, right, her husband's property. And now we see that women are able to take on their husband's property as their property too. Sometimes because it is their property, they actually add to it, right, to her husband's property. However, when we find that during the American Revolution, things ended up being much harder for different groups of people. Obviously, African Americans, both men and women, the American Revolution made it virtually impossible for them to gain their freedom, particularly in the South. We find that the slave trade continues well after the American Revolution. And, the 3/5 clause that you probably have heard of in every U.S. history class made it difficult to abolish slavery and basically institutionalize and legitimize slavery throughout the United States. There was a quack on TV, and he kind of argued that the 3/5 clause was good because it gave some kind of political representation to slaves, and nothing could be further from the truth. They didn't get the political representation. The white plantation owners actually benefited, because of this clause, and made slavery virtually impossible to diminish in the United States until the U.S. Civil War. So don't let anybody tell you that this was a good thing, because it was not. We find that, again, the American Constitution and what happens in the aftermath of the American Revolution, women were excluded from different opportunities, from juries, from legal training. Obviously, they were denied the vote until 1920, and we'll talk about that later. There are examples where certain people could vote, particularly people with land, which tended to exclude women. Obviously, African Americans were completely excluded. Like I said earlier, working class people, people who are just poor, men or women, were excluded. And we find that a lot of times women were excluded based on kind of gender stereotypes that, as we talked about, again, the whole Adam and Eve story, how Eve corrupts Adam, even though Adam was the moron who took the apple, right? Nobody puts the blame on him. Everybody puts the blame on Eve. And we find that that kind of argument is put on women when it comes to voting, saying, look, women are easily corruptible when it comes to voting, so we can't let them vote because they're going to be swayed by, men who seduce them, So we should not let women vote was, the argument back then. And instead, women are given this title called Republican Motherhood. Now, this is a consolation prize, if you will, for their activism during the American Revolution, as the reading kind of highlighted. Right, they were in the fields. They were cooking. They were spying. They were holding guns and shooting and participating. And they were not allowed to be viewed as equal citizens. But rather instead they're given this title of Republican Motherhood, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture too, because this concept of Republican Motherhood basically limits the opportunities of what women can do. This idea of Republican Motherhood puts women in the home, that a good U.S. citizen, a good U.S. Woman devotes herself for her country. She devotes herself to the home, taking care of her kids, making sure they get proper education, taking care of the household, making sure it's clean, and devotes herself to her husband, and that's her only duty as a citizen at this point. So we'll talk about this because this impacts women's opportunity to go get jobs, because the idea is that women must stay at home, but the perception is that this is within a heterosexual relationship, right? That the man always stays with you, or you're married or whatever. So again, there's a lot of problems with this, but this becomes the ideal, right? If you want to talk about the virgin whore dichotomy, this would be that idea of that concept of the virgin, right? The good mother, that Castañeda's kind of talking about in her reading. So what do we learn? I'm going to have you do an assignment looking at some art, looking at how women are used in art during the American Revolution. But what do we learn? We number one, we find how feminism emerges during this period. This in the late 1700s for the first time. Somebody's saying, intellectual level, that women have the ability to reason just like any other man, right? We find that women participated in the American Revolution, and again, the reading, I think, does a really nice job addressing the different examples of how they participated, and I can't stress this enough, is how many men did not participate in the revolution, yet they were the benefactors of the outcome. And even though women did participate, they got nothing, right, out of all this. So this makes it very kind of problematic when we talk about the American Revolution. And then, like I said earlier, I'm going to have some political art, have you guys analyze it, and have you, just give me your interpretation of what you see, and see how women are addressed in some of the political art of the 1770s. All right, so I think we'll stop it there. And the next lesson will focus on around the 1830s. We're going to focus a lot on New York, where America becomes an industrialized power.